Chapter 14. So chapter 14 is on leases, okay? And leases could be kind of lumped in a lot of students' mind in the property management type section because those two pretty much go hand in hand. And like I've said before, when you go to take your national test, there is quite a few questions on property management. The reason for that is, like we discussed one of the first few days, is that this national exam is a broker level exam, okay? South Dakota is a one licensed state. We don't have two separate licenses. We used to up until the mid 2000s. We had two licenses like most of the states around us. Minnesota's this way, Iowa is this way as well. So when you go through a course like what you're going through now, you would be going through it to get your salesperson's license. You would take a state and national salesperson's test. And then if you were in the business for a few years and you wanted to get your broker license so you could go open up your own office or take over your existing one, then you would go through a similar course again and you'd take a state and national broker exam. South Dakota did away with the salesperson exam entirely. So when you're going through this course, you're going through a broker level course and you're taking a broker level state and national exam. It does make it more difficult, I understand that. But the benefit is that it's much easier, of course, than to get your broker license because you don't have to go back and take any tests like you would if you lived in other states. But on the other side of that coin is that you're going to need to understand issues that you wouldn't have had to know as much about if you were taking the salesperson's course. So you're going to have a better understanding of property management because as a broker, you can do property management. You're going to have a better understanding of how a trust account works, and that's something that we're going to discuss in class on the trust account. So there are, and settlement statements. Chapter 12 talks about closing and then it feeds into the settlement statements. That's a part of being a broker, understanding how those work. Whether or not you do them in the real world, that's irrelevant. Understanding how to do them now is important to you passing the exam. So let's get into chapter 14 and talk about leases. A lease is a contract that transfers the right of exclusive possession and the use of the lessor's real property to the tenant or lessee for a specified period of time. The lessee is the tenant and the lessor is the owner or landlord. You could see either word used. Remember, the or is the one always giving, and the double E or the E is the one receiving, like an employer or employee. Demise is the last word on this slide, and this always has to deal with leasing. Okay? So on a test, you could see the word demise, and you could see the word devise. So we have demise that we're currently talking about. It's the conveyance of the right of possession, or it's dealing with leasing or renting. Or we can look at the word devise. And devise is how we transfer real property through a will, or it's the act of transferring real property through a will. That's a devise. So one is dealing with owning property in fee simple, or transferring real property through a will, and one is talking about leasing or renting. Or going back to one of our previous chapters, we could say freehold estate, which is fee simple, versus a non-freehold estate, which is leasing or renting. Remember back to that picture with the little bird's nest and the for rent sign for non-freehold, which we'll look again here in this chapter. So the next we have the reversionary right. Okay, the reversionary right is owned by or retained by the landlord or owner. They have one of those sticks of interest. We can call this one the reversionary right because they know that that unit is eventually coming back to them. Yes, it's leased for 6 months or a year or 2 years, but eventually, when that tenant vacates, it's coming back to them. We also looked at that reversionary right in a prior chapter. We talked about the life estate. The life estate, the grantor and the remaindermen, they both have that reversionary right. Next, we're going to talk about leasehold interests. And these leasehold interests are just like those non-freehold estates that we looked at earlier, except we're replacing the word estate for the word tenancy. So take a minute, you can press pause and you can go back to the prior chapter where these were located, and you can review these terms. But the definitions are going to remain the same. It's just that, again, we're swapping out the word tenancy, or the word estate, for the word tenancy. So tenancy for years is the same as an estate for years in a non-freehold estate. And so we have a definite period of time. There's no expiration date. Remember, I think I gave the example of something like a lease from January 2nd, 1992 to December 31st, 2013. Just because it says an estate for years or tenancy for years does not mean it's for one full complete year or complete years. We can have a tenancy for years that goes for 37 days, okay? But the thing I want you to remember is that it's for a definite period of time. It has a stated beginning and stated end. And once it ends, there's no need to give a 30-day notice, because once it's over, and the tenant is expected to be out, okay? Number 2 is the periodic tenancy. Periodic tenancy is just exactly like the periodic estate, same definition. And if you remember back, this is when you have tenancy or possession from period to period, okay? So 30 days, or quarter to quarter, or year to year. That's periodic tenancy. Also, you have to give 1 period's notice to cancel. So if you're on a quarter to quarter type situation in the lease, then you have to give 1 period's notice, which would be 1 quarter or 3 months. Okay? There's no set termination date, because this lease will automatically renew. It'll keep going and going. Now remember, back to when we were looking at these in the form of a non-freehold estate, and I had said, while we're going through these, please do not try to cram these in to the prior lease that you were in, or the lease that you had back in your college days, or maybe if you're a small business owner, the current lease that you're in with your owner of the commercial space you lease. Please don't do that, because it's going to add some confusion. Our leases are different today. They're variations of what these are, okay? These are just the 4 classifications of either a non-freehold estate or leasehold interest, okay? So when I look at this periodic estate or periodic tenancy, a good example that we have, I should say a loose example, is ag ground. Ag is from year to year. But when you go to terminate that, you don't give 1 period's notice. You have to let them know by, I think it's September 1st in the state of South Dakota, and then you're done by, if you give them the September 1st notification, then you no longer are leasing it come next spring. And so that's just shy of 6 months notice. But it is similar to a periodic estate or periodic tenancy, because it does automatically renew, and it's for 1 year, year to year. So those 2 facets of an ag lease here in the state are very similar to a periodic tenancy, but it's not identical. Okay, so again, don't try to cram or fit your experience into these, because it's just going to add to frustration. Number 3, we have tenancy at will, or we could say an estate at will, if I was looking back at the non-freehold estates. And this is the right to possess with the consent of the owner for an uncertain period of time. Either party can terminate. If you remember back to my example, we had a Super Bowl party. okay? And you were going to host a Super Bowl party and have people over to your house. And once the party is over, everybody's expected to leave. And so there is no set end time. It's just when it's over. If the game's over at 10:30, then we need to leave. If it's over at 11:30 or 9:15, there's no set end time. Tenancy of sufferance occurs when the party is still there after they're supposed to be gone. So if I look at that tenancy at will, Super Bowl party's over at 10:30, and most everybody's gone, and you still have a couple people there. But eventually, everybody leaves except for one person, and they're still sitting at your house the next morning when you wake up. They're sitting downstairs on the couch. Maybe their team lost, and they're just so devastated they're in a state of shock. Who knows? So they're still there. That's going to be considered a holdover tenant. On your typical lease, if you have a tenant where we have the lease expired and it doesn't automatically renew, and they're supposed to be gone by December 31st and they're still there on January 7th, then they're a holdover tenant, or this is a tenancy at sufferance. Termination of the lease. Termination may have a little bit of a negative connotation to that. I understand that. Think of the movie Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So it does have a little bit of a negative connotation, and we may be thinking of an eviction. And although an eviction may have a loose connection with this termination of a lease, really what we're doing is we're ending the lease. Okay? So when you think of, or you see this in a test, the termination of a lease, even though it may carry a negative connotation, don't always just approach it that way. Just look at it as the lease has ended. It's finalized. So it finalizes or ends when we have expiration. And we have some examples of these expirations. For tenancy at will and periodic tenancy, we need to have written notice because they automatically renew. Tenancy for years, it expires on the termination date. Remember, we have a set beginning and set end date. And then tenancy at sufferance, at any time you can get the tenant out. That's a very important slide to highlight because you're going to be questioned on those scenarios of expiration when you go to take your exam. Number two, we can have agreement of the parties. So we'd have a mutual agreement where the landlord and lessee, or the tenant and lessor, mutually agree to end this lease. So the landlord's just going to release the tenant out. And so if that's the case, we're going to have what's called surrender and acceptance. Okay? Tenant is surrendering the unit, landlord's accepting it back in its condition, and that is going to be a term that you may see, and it's always attached to this agreement between the parties, this mutual agreement to release the tenant out of the current lease situation. Breach of condition, if either party breaks the terms of the lease, the injured party can sue for damages and cancel. Condemnation. Remember our government powers, we had 4 of them. And the second, or the first E, that spelled the word Pete, P-E-T-E, the first E was eminent domain. And eminent domain is the government's right to come in and take land. And if that happens, here, in this situation, again, they're going to use what's called condemnation to do that. But if they come in through eminent domain and take this apartment building that you live in, then you're going to be compensated as the tenant. Notice, if proper notice is not given, the tenant can be held for another term, such as a periodic lease. If you're in a 6-month to 6-month periodic lease and you don't give the 6-month notice, you'll be held for another term or another 6 months. Eviction. There's 2 different types of eviction. We have actual and constructive. We saw those 2 words, actual and constructive, earlier in a prior chapter when we looked at notice. We're talking about filing a deed. actual notice and constructive notice. When I look at actual eviction versus constructive eviction, it's a little bit different. Actual eviction is going to be the eviction that most people think about when they think of the word eviction. Personally, when I think of the word eviction, I'm thinking of a tenant that's getting the boot. The tenant defaulted on their rent. The tenant is a holdover tenant. They haven't vacated when they're supposed to. And so the landlord now is going to initiate that eviction process and kick the tenant out. That's an actual eviction. And that's how I think of it. An actual eviction is the eviction that I actually think about when I think about what an eviction would mean to me. Constructive eviction is the opposite. Before I move on, I want to finish out this slide on eviction. And throughout that eviction process, what's going to be the landlord or the owner or the property manager that's handling the property, they're going to get this forcible entry and detainer. So they're going to get this forcible entry and detainer from a judge, and that's going to be one of the final steps in getting that tenant evicted, or they're going to be able to show up with somebody from the local police department or sheriff's department and get this person out of the building. The constructive eviction is where the tenant can terminate if the owner interferes with that lessee's quiet enjoyment. We talked about quiet enjoyment before. And again, quiet enjoyment is not the guarantee that your neighbors will not throw loud parties. Quiet enjoyment means that this tenant that I am, or this unit that I as a tenant am leasing is mine and exclusively mine. That I have the peace of mind knowing when I come home, no stranger's going to be sleeping in my bed. Those keys are my keys and my keys only, and I'm the only one that has access to this unit aside from maintenance or the landlord. Also, if the owner has, let's say, promised to pay for the water bill and the water gets shut off because the owner stops making the payment, my quiet enjoyment has been interrupted. Or we could say that the property is uninhabitable. There are steps that a tenant would take. They have different options according to South Dakota state law, but it's not important for you to know those. If you were to take a property management course, sure, but it's not going to be something you'll find on your real estate exam. If the property is uninhabitable, let's say that there's a fire or a car crashes through your front door and destroys your living room. Property is uninhabitable. So you can, as a tenant, then do what's called a constructive eviction and get yourself out of the lease. So in a sense, you're kind of evicting yourself. So we have the actual eviction, which is the tenant kicking out the landlord, or I'm sorry, the landlord kicking out the tenant. And then we have the constructive eviction, which is the opposite, where the tenant is living here and it's not inhabitable, or their quiet enjoyment has been interrupted, and so the tenant is going to basically lawfully get themselves out of the lease. Statute of Fraud is in this chapter. It's a word that we have used many times before. And Statute of Fraud says that all real estate contracts have to be in writing except for leases that are less than 1 year. Okay? Quiet enjoyment, we defined that just a few minutes ago, but it's where the lessee may enjoy without interruption or invasion by the lessor. Assignment transfers the remainder of the interest, rights, lease, or other instruments over. So in a typical lease situation, we have the landlord that's leasing to tenant 1. And we know the landlord or tenant 1 pays rent to the landlord. Okay? In an assignment, I always use this commercial space, for example, because that's typically where you would see an assignment take place. You wouldn't really see it take place in residential or multifamily, although it could take place, but just for example's sake, to help you understand assignment. Let's say I'm in a 5-year lease, okay? And so I'm actually 3 years into this 5-year lease, and I find a new space to lease, okay? So what I would do with the owner's permission is I would find a tenant to assign this lease to. So I'm tenant 1, and tenant 2 now is going to take over this lease. They're going to continue out the remaining 2 years that are left in this 5-year lease. So I find tenant 2, and tenant 2 is going to pay rent to the landlord. This is what an assignment looks like. And you may be wondering, well, why would I do that? Because if you look at how the example is, I'm still attached. Contractually, I'm still bound. Yeah, that's true. That's a good observation. It's not really in my favor to do the assignment because if tenant 2 stops making the rent payments, guess who the landlord is going to come after? That's right, myself. But for your test, you need to understand that that's what an assignment looks like. I am going to be called the assignor, and tenant 2 is the assignee. Look at the other bullet point on the slide. It says that the assignor remains liable unless released by the owner. Novation is where that release would take place. So I'm going to draw this out on a separate example. Novation is this, where I still have the landlord, but myself, tenant 1, has been released out of the picture. And now the remainder of this lease is between tenant 2 and the landlord. And that's going to benefit me because I'm no longer bound like I was here in this assignment. And so this is called a novation. You may also see it called an assignment with a release. Either one. It's going to mean the same thing. Another way that this could be defined as this assignment is where I'm substituting one party for another. Or they could say I'm substituting a contract for another. If you see that word substitution, it's going to be a good tip-off that we're talking about novation or an assignment with a release. A common question that comes up when I talk about this is, well, what's the difference between that and a sublet or a sublease? I'm glad you asked. So if you look at the next slide, it says in the sublet, a sublet retains interest and responsibility. The sublessor is the original tenant, the subtenant is the new lessee, and you can sublet all or part. So let me show you up on the board how that all makes sense. So we have our assignment, we have our assignment with the release or novation. Let's look at our sublet, or we could call it the sublease. So in this scenario, I have the landlord, and I have the lease to myself again, tenant 1. So it's starting off to look a lot like assignment, but you'll see how there is a distinct difference between the two. So in this space here, I have a couple classrooms, and I also have currently, I have 2 offices up front. One office I use personally, and the other office is more of a catch-all type space. So let's say I wanted to lease out that front office space. I found a business that is looking at just starting up, and they need just an office space, and maybe they're going to share my conference area as well, and maybe have shared use of the secretary, what have you. So I just want to lease out that one little office. I'm going to retain everything else. Everything else is mine. I might have some shared use with that new tenant, but really everything else is going to be mine. I'm just trying to fill that vacant spot and maybe generate some extra revenue. So I would, again, with the owner's permission, I would sublease. You may ask yourself, well, why do you have to get the owner's permission to do this sublease or to do the assignment? Well, number one, if you're a property manager representing the owner, you're going to want to make sure that that is included in the lease contract, that you have to, as a tenant, get the permission from the owner to bring in a new tenant, tenant two. One of the primary reasons for that is in your standard strip malls, there's several different types of businesses. And you may have an insurance agent, let's say with State Farm, and they're currently leasing a space in one of the many units in that strip mall. And they may also have it agreed between them and the owner or the landlord that none of their competitors can lease spaces within this strip mall. So they would be the exclusive and only insurance company or agency within this particular strip mall. So that being said, I couldn't just proactively lease a space out to whomever I wish. If I wanted to lease that out to another insurance company, I would be violating that original lease that the landlord had with that State Farm agency. So that's one of the reasons why you need to get the owner's permission. Probably not on the test, but nonetheless. So in this sublet situation, the difference here, so far again, we're looking at it and it's resembling a lot of, or looking a lot like this assignment. But here's what's going to happen. When I lease out that front office space, tenant 2, I'm going to have my own little lease with them. And tenant 2 is going to be paying me the money, and I'm going to pay the overall total rent to the landlord. So let's say my rent per month is $2,000. I charge this tenant $500 for that space. And so I take their $500 every month, combine it with the difference, which is $1,500 to get my total $2,000, and I give that to the landlord. So I am the sublessor, and tenant 2 is the sublessee. That's what a sublet situation looks like. Notice there's no line here. There's no connection between the landlord and tenant 2 as opposed to the assignment. Or even you could say the assignment with the release. Okay? That's the very distinct difference between those two. Some common clauses that are found in commercial leases. First, we're going to look at the option clause. The option clause allows the tenant the right to renew upon expiration date. If you remember back to our example of that option with the developer and the farmer, where the developer is asking the farmer for that option so that in so many years, or within so many years, that farmer is obligated to sell that land to the developer if the developer so wishes to pursue it. Similar thing with an option clause in a lease. It always is going to put the buyer or tenant, just like in the option situation where it puts the developer in the driver's seat. That's who has the control. In a lease option, the buyer has the control because they have the option to buy at the end of the lease if they so choose, and the landlord can't sell it. If the buyer, or tenant I should say, chooses to exercise the option, that means they're going to purchase it. If they choose not to, within a stated period of time, then the landlord now can put it on the market and sell it. Tax participation clause is another common clause you might see in a lease. These are probably more common in a commercial lease situation. But as the taxes go up, so does the rent. So a tax participation. The tenant is participating in helping the owner cover the taxes. Some services that you could see that are part of a lease is that the common areas are going to be the responsibility of the owner. And so if you go into our building, for instance, there's a restroom, a men's and women's restroom that's made available to all the tenants, and they're, in this case, in ProEd's case, the students, or we could say like the customers as well of the insurance company that's in the building, or the massage company that's in the building. So their clients and customers, of course, have free access to those restrooms as well. And that's going to be considered a common area. So the landlord, as well as the staircase, the foyer, all that is responsibility of the landlord. Okay. The right to enter, the lessor reserves the right, that's the owner or landlord, the right to enter the premises, and they can enter for repairs or improvements, to check smoke alarms, and so on. Interruption of business. If the building is destroyed, the tenant is relieved from payment. There's also an insurance waiver, and some policies call it an interruption of business rider. Some call it a different name. But that interruption of business rider that you could put on your policy, because when you go to lease a commercial space, you're going to be required to have an insurance policy as well. But that extra rider, which is pretty minimal, just a few bucks a year to put on your policy, basically would help to take care of you if something happened and you needed to temporarily move out. So let's say a fire destroyed the building, or let's use a better example. Let's say a flood came in and just basically went up the walls about 2 or 3 feet, and then it caused you to have to vacate. With that interruption of business rider, you would be able to vacate, and the expenses in you doing that, like for instance at ProEd, I would be able to, if it was right in the middle of class time or a school session when this happened, I could temporarily relocate into, like, let's say one of the conference halls at a hotel, and then the cost in doing so and then moving back would be covered with that interruption of business rider. Not too certain that you're going to see it on a test, probably unlikely that you will. Improvements. The landlord is not required to make improvements or alterations, and in fact, you as a tenant have to have approval if you're going to make those alterations in that building. Trade fixtures, it's a word that we've already discussed, but just to reemphasize it, trade fixtures are always going to be considered personal property, especially for test purposes, okay? If a trade fixture, like this dry erase board, remember that this would be considered a trade fixture. It's permanently attached in the manner that it is put on this wall. I don't want to say permanently. I can still get it off if I need to. But a dry erase board or a dentist chair is attached by nature. If I look at the definition of an attachment or fixture, it's attached. But it's part of my trade, this dry erase board, so I'm going to take it with me when I leave. But if I happen to leave it in here after my lease expires or upon expiration for test purposes, this is not personal property anymore. Now it is a fixture that has to stay with this unit. It belongs to the landlord. And that's for test. You know, a lot of times in the real world, they give you some extra time if you need it to get rid of, to move out and so on. But for test purposes, that now is the property of the landlord. The Uniform Residential Tenant Act, Landlord and Tenant Act, This is definitely something you could see on your exam. And really all it does, it's quite simply just gives out some rules and guidelines for tenants to follow and rules and guidelines for landlords to follow. And they're really basic. It's not rocket science. It's that, for instance, the tenant has to keep the premises clean. They have to keep the premises up. They can't destroy the premises, and they have to pay their rent on time. And they can't disturb other tenants. The obligation of the landlord, again, is just as simple. They have to keep up with minimum housing codes, perform repairs, provide safe and livable conditions, and then quiet enjoyment must be provided. Lease provisions, we have things like security deposits. Security deposits are going to be returned once the expiration date hits and the tenant vacates. Of course, the owner or landlord or property management company that's managing the property reserves the right to retain any or all of that security deposit if they need to make repairs. That security deposit cannot be higher than 1 month's rent. So if your 1 month's rent is $1,000, or the rent is $1,000 per month, they can't charge you $1,500 for your security deposit. There are certain exceptions to that. You can have written agreement between the parties that the tenant gives the landlord the okay to charge more. If you have a smoker, for instance, you can charge more, or a pet, you can charge more for that initial deposit. So there are always going to be, as we've seen throughout most of this course, exceptions to the rule. The rent control is the next one. It is a burden on the landlord. That would be a good test question. But how rent control works is where the state or local government has put a ceiling on how much the landlord can charge for rent. So they can only charge this much for this type of unit. And it happened in larger cities. I don't know of any example locally where we have rent control. But you go into larger communities where we had a lot of tenants, so the demand was high for apartments, but the supply, the amount of apartments that were out there, was low. And so in those scenarios, the landlords were starting to capitalize on that and charge higher rents because they could. They had a lot of renters or tenants. And so the city or local government stepped in or state and set some caps or ceilings on how much a landlord can charge so that things were more affordable. If you have watched TV in the last decade or two, you remember probably some TV shows like Seinfeld or Friends. And both of those had some of their stars in the TV series, both looking to rent apartments that were rent controlled. I think both of them also took place in New York. So, but yeah, both of them had episodes where particular people from the cast were trying to rent units that were rent controlled. They made a big deal about it, a big fuss, because these units were extremely cheap because rent hadn't been raised since the 50s or 60s. So it was very, very cheap to get in. So some types of leases that we may come across, predominantly these are going to be in the commercial arena of real estate, is net lease. That's our first one. And this is where the tenant agrees to pay ownership expenses. This includes all or a portion of the property expenses. And so we see in the bullet points that we have a single, double, or triple net lease. And so the example that I have up here on the board, this is a very basic example. This is just to help you kind of grasp the term. I realize that in the real world, these may be set up a little bit different. But on a single net lease, we have items like taxes, utilities, insurance, and maintenance. And so in a single net lease, you're going to have a base rent that you're going to pay, plus you're going to pay a portion of the taxes. And so if I had a building over here the strip mall, and I have units A, B, C, D, E, and F. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. I would take my total property taxes. Let's say the total property taxes are $10,500. I would divide by 12, and each unit would pay a portion thereof. Again, in the real world, this might be constructed a little bit different. If these units were different sizes, you might pay accordingly. So if I'm leasing a 3,000 square foot space versus a 1,000 square foot space, I might pay more in property taxes than the other owner of the 1,000 square foot space because my space is bigger. Double net is where I may pay utilities and insurance. And a triple net is where I may pay the maintenance, taxes, and insurance. And that's not by the book. That's just how those single, double, and triple net may play out. And just so you understand further that in a triple net, I'm just giving the example that you may pay maintenance, insurance, and taxes. You could pay taxes, utilities, and insurance. It just depends on however the lease is negotiated. Next, we have a straight, gross, or flat lease. This is where the tenant pays a fixed amount and the owner pays all the other expenses. So in commercial, a gross lease, I would just pay $1,000 a month, and when it comes to the electricity and all those other expenses, the owner's going to take care of that for me. A very common example of this in the residential, of course, is an apartment. Apartments they rent for $500 a month or $650 or $700, and that's all you pay. You're not going to pay any portion of the owner's property taxes on that apartment. A percentage lease, we're going to see this in a math formula here in a later chapter, and you're going to learn how to do these percentage lease calculations. But a percentage lease is where the tenant agrees to pay a fixed base rent plus a certain percent of the gross income that comes in over a predetermined amount of sales. And so it's very common to have a percentage lease in shopping malls, in strip centers, retail stores, grocery stores, movie theaters. And so if you're taking the test and they have a question about which of the following types of stores or businesses would be most likely using a percentage lease, you're going to look at retail stores, so Macy's, Target, Sears, Yonkers, JCPenney's. You're also going to look at stores outside of that type of retail, department stores. You're going to look at Lowe's, Home Depot, Menards, movie theaters like the Carmike Movie Theater or Century Movie Theater. Those types of businesses are going to be more commonly, even like Hy-Vee, a grocery store, or Sunshine Foods. They're probably going to be on a percentage lease if they don't already own the building. Up on the board, I have an example for you of a percentage lease. This isn't Macy's actual percentage lease, but we're going to use this just to give you a reference. Macy's is a department store here in the mall. They're a national franchise. And so Macy's has, we'll say, this percentage lease with the mall. And you may ask, well, what, as we go through this, you're going to wonder, well, why would they do a percentage lease? And hopefully I'll give you a couple scenarios. Again, we'll do a math problem with it later. But you'll see that a percentage lease really creates a win-win. It's a win for Macy's. It's a win for the owner of the mall that Macy's is located in. So if Macy's has a really, really, really good year and it's profitable, then the owner of the mall gets to share in those profits If Macy's has a horrible year, then Macy's Corporation doesn't have to worry about it too much because they just have to take care of their base rent. And it'll make more sense as we go through this example. So Macy's pays $25,000 per month plus 10% in gross, or 10% on top of their sales once their gross sales exceed $2 million. So let's say, for example's sake, that in August of this year, their total gross sales are $2,150,000. So now, as you can see there, they've exceeded that 2 million mark. Okay? So now they've exceeded that 2 million mark, and so in September, the next month, they're going to pay their $25,000 base, like they do every single month, plus they're going to pay 10% of whatever their gross sales are. So let's say their gross sales for September, August we had our back to school sales and crazy days, and Macy's really did well, but September's a quieter month, let's say, for the retail. And so in September, they only do $100,000. Let's say they do $100,000 for their gross sales. So they do $100,000, and they have to pay the owner of that mall 10% of that $100,000. So we're going to take 10% times that $100,000, and that gives us how much? $10,000. So they'll take the $25,000 and they'll add the $10,000 to it, and so they'll write a check out for that month of September for $35,000. Let's move over to October. So they're still again going to pay the $25,000 base. And let's say in October they have a little bit better month, and so they sell $250,000 in October. So we're going to take 10% of that because of this percentage lease. So that's $25,000 that we're going to add to this $25,000. So they're going to cut a check for that month of October for a total of $50,000. So as you can see, because Macy's had a good year, they exceeded that $2 million. Now every month after that, they're going to have to pay out to the owner of the mall 10%. That 10% is probably a high number as far as what the going rate for Macy's is. Is Macy's really $25,000 per month plus 10% once gross sales exceed $2 million? Most likely they're not. I just made that up. So, but this is really the nuts and bolts of how a percentage lease will work. So a common question that comes up is, do they have to do this for the rest of their life? No. This goes from January 1st, 2001 to December 31st, 2001. And then January 1st, 2002, we start our ticker all the way back at 0. So they're going to pay $25,000 per month, 10% once gross sales exceed $2 million. And let's say in 2002, their gross sales don't exceed $2 million until they hit October. So then in November, December, they're going to have to pay 10%. And then once 2003 hits, they start back at 0 again. And then let's say in 2003 they have a really, really, really good year, and they hit it in May. In May they hit $2 million. So June, July, August, September, October, November, December, those 8 months, they're going to have to pay 10%, like we've done here for September and October, on top of those, on top of their rent. 10% of the gross sales for that month are going to be included with their base rent for that month as well. So we kind of start back at 0 at the beginning of each year and then go from there. So that's really the nuts and bolts of a percentage lease. We'll see a math problem that we'll do later. Chances are, with all the math that's out there that you'll see on your test, you probably won't see a percentage lease math question. I may have said it before, but I'll say it again. When you go to take these national exams, for instance, that's where you're probably going to see this math at. Let's say there's, for instance, there's 12 different national exams. Because if you fail one national exam and you go back to retake it, you're not going to, chances are you're not going to retake the same national exam. You're going to have a different national exam that you're going to retake. You're going to see a lot of the similar questions, but not everything is going to be the same. Okay? So out of those 12, you might see one question out of those 12 exams. So let me clarify this. One of those 12 exams might have one math question with a percentage lease. Okay? So it's very, very unlikely that you're going to see it. But if you just happen to be that lucky duck that gets that test, I want you to have an idea of how it works. Okay? So percentage lease. The next one we have is a ground lease. And the ground lease is for the purpose of leasing unimproved land or ground only. And typically what you'll see put on those unimproved tracts of land is recreational use type structures like a golf course. So we have an example here in Sioux Falls where one of our country clubs is on a 99-year ground lease. And so they don't own the land, they lease it. And when those 99 years are up, everything that tenant has erected on the land goes back to the owner. I'm not going to get into the schematics of the golf course because that's usually a common question. Well, what happens to the golf course? Does it just go back to the owner and now nobody can go golf on it except for the owner? I don't know. It really doesn't matter. What you need to understand for your test is that in a ground lease, it's typically long-term. A lot of times you'll see a 99-year ground lease, and the tenant does not own the ground, but they erect structures on it. At the end of that ground lease, everything that has been erected on that land goes back to the owner. Okay? Hope that helps. The sandwich lease is what happens when we have that sublease. If you remember, you can rewind the video and go back to that picture that I drew with the landlord and tenant 1 and tenant 2, where I was subleasing out that front office space to a business owner. So in a sandwich lease, the lessor, the owner, is on top. The sublessor, which was myself, is in the middle. And the sublessee is on the bottom of that sandwich. It wouldn't hurt to know that order for your test. Probably won't see it, but you know, we have a sandwich. We have 3 parts. We have the top, the middle, and the bottom. The lessor is always on top. They're always the one with the most cards, the most skin in the game, the most control. I would be in the middle, the sublessor. I'm the next one in the order or in rank. And then finally, the bottom of it is going to be the sublessee. So sandwich lease is a sublease or sublet situation. A sale leaseback is the next one. A sale leaseback is when we have a store like Walgreens, for instance, this is what they commonly do. They would come in and they'd buy the piece of ground that they wanted to erect the Walgreens on. So we have one here in Sioux Falls, probably on one of the more busy corners, the more prominent corners in the city, on 41st and Louise. Right on the corner is a Walgreens. And so they buy the ground, and then from there, they go in and they develop it. They put in the parking lot, the building, the structure, and everything goes up. Sign, all of it. And so they have it finished, it's completed. And then they sell it. They sell it off to a group of investors. And then they lease it back from that group of investors. It may sound a little bit weird that you would go through all that work, but here's a little bit of a scenario. Let's say they purchase, and the cost to erect the structure, the total cost for buying the ground, putting the building on it with the parking lot is $5 million. Okay? When they sell it off to the investors, they're going to buy it for $15 million. So now Walgreens has $10 million in their pocket, and they can go do this basically 2 more times, right? If it costs them $5 million to purchase and put up the structure, and now after the sale they have $10 million, they can go do it 2 more times. So it frees up, or actually adds a lot more cash back into their pocket so they can go and duplicate this. And Walgreens, when they lease it back and they put all their inventory in the structure or in the building, and they train the staff and they get the store ready and they turn the lights on and open the doors, they're making money from day one. There's no worry or fear that they're not going to make it. Okay, so to pay these investors or to rent, to make the lease payments, is a non-issue for Walgreens. Okay, so Hy-Vee has done this a few times. It's a large grocery store. They don't do it every time, but a couple times they've done it in different cities. They sell it off to a group of investors and they lease it back from them. Again, Hy-Vee would not have any concern about making the lease payments. There's also the ability to write off the lease payments that you make when it comes time for taxes. There's a portion that's tax deductible. And what would happen if Walgreens just went belly up? Well, they're tenants, right? So it's a lot easier just to wash their hands of it and vacate. So there's some advantages of it. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's an option. That's what a sale leaseback looks like. Within our leases, we also have our different types of leases. We have graduated leases or stepped up lease. Typically, those are used to attract tenants into areas that it's difficult to get tenants to move into. And so they have this big carrot dangling out in front of a prospective tenant, where if you move in, the first year and second year, as you can see on the slide, is $400. Year 2 and 3 is $450, and year 5 is $500. And so that's a graduated lease or a stepped up lease. They're both the same word used interchangeably, just like our gross lease from before, or straight lease or term lease. Okay. Index lease. Index lease, the rent is tied to an index like a consumer price index outside the control of both the landlord and tenant. And so, for example, when the consumer price index goes up, so does the rent. So naturally, a business whose income is attached to the consumer price index, where the business increases revenue when that goes up or decreases, That would make the most sense. And within that type of lease, there's what's called an escalation clause. Escalation clause is used to allow for that payment to adjust. So when you think of the escalation clause, I want you to think of an escalator. What does an escalator do? It goes up and it goes down. And that's it for that chapter.